Bienvenidos de vuelta a nexos+1 Foro Latam 2024 y a nuestro bloque dedicado al capital natural. Por capital natural nos referimos a todos los activos naturales como el aire, el suelo, el agua, las plantas y los animales, de los cuales se derivan servicios que nos benefician. Estos pueden ser alimentos, medicinas, materiales de construcción, combustibles y hasta protección frente a eventos climáticos extremos como inundaciones. 5 de los 10 países más ricos en capital natural se encuentran en Latinoamérica, según el Índice de Capital Natural 2023 de la consultora Solability. Valorizar la naturaleza en términos económicos está ayudando al sector privado a comprender el valor real de los servicios ecosistémicos y así dar materialidad a la toma de decisiones para detener y revertir la pérdida de biodiversidad y ecosistemas naturales. Y en este contexto, ¿qué se espera de las empresas? Que monitoreen, analicen y divulguen sus riesgos, dependencias e impactos en la biodiversidad. Esto les ayudará a estar un paso adelante de nuevas exigencias regulatorias y de mercado. Me encantó cómo lo puso hace poco Tim de Salesforce. Él dijo, a las empresas les puede ir bien haciendo las cosas bien. Para ampliar un poco más este contexto, vamos con una cápsula informativa a cargo de Sara Calvo, jefe de proyectos de Libélula. Adelante, Sara.
Gracias, Pía. Vamos con los datos de esta pastilla informativa. Todos dependemos de la naturaleza, las ciudades, las empresas, la sociedad y la economía. El 55% del PBI de Latinoamérica depende de ella. Además, recordemos que los océanos, los bosques y el suelo absorben la mitad de las emisiones globales de gases de efecto invernadero. Según la consultora KPMG, proteger la naturaleza y biodiversidad podría representar para las empresas hasta $10 billones en oportunidades de nuevos negocios, eficiencia en el uso de recursos y reducción de costos. También se estima que 400 millones de nuevos empleos se crearían globalmente al 2030. A fines de año entrará en vigor la Ley contra la Deforestación de la Unión Europea, la cual prohibirá importar productos que generen pérdidas de bosques a nivel mundial. Esta ley garantizará que los productos como del ganado, la soya, el aceite de palma, la madera, el cacao, el café y el caucho no se puedan vender a la Unión Europea si se obtienen de áreas afectadas por prácticas de deforestación o de degradación forestal. Volvemos al estudio.
Muchas gracias, Sara. Y realmente es increíble que dependemos de la naturaleza, pero también es bueno recordar que somos naturaleza, venimos de la naturaleza y volvemos a ella. Y para entender cómo va avanzando el sector privado en la acción por el capital natural, ya está con nosotros Daniel O'Brien, Partner de Sustainability and ESG en PricewaterhouseCoopers. La presentación de Daniel será en inglés. Quienes quieran escucharla traducida al español, nuevamente podrán usar el botón de traducción de Zoom que está en la pantalla en la parte inferior. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello, nice to be here today.
Thank you.
Great, well, very good to see all of you today. I'm Dan O'Brien. I'm a partner with PwC in our sustainability team, based in Vancouver, Canada, so quite far north from where most of you are today. Today, I was going to speak about some work that PwC has done over the past few years to look at how our economy is dependent on nature, and also to talk a bit about my role with the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and to talk through some of the reasons why nature and natural capital is really coming to the forefront of discussions around ESG and sustainability. I'm just going to share my screen as I have a few slides to share with you. So first of all, I think the big question to answer is what do we mean by nature? Nature is a very broad topic that gets used. The term gets used quite frequently. It's often interchanged with the word biodiversity as well. Nature is really all of the natural environment that we depend on in the world, and it's made up of various realms, which are made up of the land, fresh water, oceans, atmospheres. And within those realms, we have specific biomes. And the biomes are the different ecosystem types that exist around the world. So things like tropical and subtropical forests, freshwater ecosystem, grasslands, for example. And these different biomes, they provide us with environmental assets. So things like the land that we rely on to grow food, the water resources that we rely on, but they also provide us with ecosystem services. So these are flows of goods and services that come from the natural environment. Things like biomass, the wood that we harvest to build with, the food that we grow, the minerals that we extract from the ground. But there's also other services, cultural services. So the ability to recreate, or the value of natural beauty that comes to, say, where we live and real estate. And also regulating services. So the ability to filter water or improve air quality or regulate climate or mitigate floods and the like. So all of these aspects of nature are things that we kind of take for granted. And up until recently, we've never really looked at the value of these in terms of an economic value. So a few years back, we did some work with the World Economic Forum, and we looked at the materiality of nature impacts and dependencies to industry. So essentially, where companies in certain industries are potentially impacting nature and their dependencies on them. And what we found is that more than half of global economic activity is materially dependent on nature. That amounts to about $58 trillion of annual economic value. And that means that if those systems start to break down, that these companies, this economic activity is at threat. These companies will experience significant financial impacts, or may even not be able to operate. What we did is we looked a little bit closer at where this is happening in the value chain. And you can see these 5 industries, which represent about $13 trillion of economic activity, or 12%, all of their direct operations are materially dependent on nature. So agriculture, forestry, fisheries and aquaculture, food, beverage and tobacco, and construction. But it's not just their direct operations, it's also upstream in their value chain. So who they're sourcing their products from in their suppliers, and also the direct customers. So who's using their products. When you look a little bit broader, you can see that there's 11 industries where 35% of the economic value has a moderate or high dependency on nature. And I think that the important point to make here is what we're showing here is those sectors, those industries that are materially dependent on nature. But 100% of our economy is, at the end of the day, dependent on nature. This gives you kind of a bit of a view of how this dependency is distributed geographically. So this is essentially the top 19 major stock exchanges around the world. And you can see that half of equity listed on these exchanges is exposed to material nature risks. In Latin America, you probably are 5th in terms of the representation in terms of exposure on stock exchanges. So what this has done is it's created a sort of significant awareness that a lot of the capital invested in companies, a lot of that economic activity is in fact dependent on nature and natural capital and the environmental services that nature provides. So that's a concern, because there's a lot of potential risk there. But to understand what that risk looks like, we also have to understand where we're impacting nature and what effects these business activities are having on nature. There's no effect if we're continuing to use these resources without any negative effect to the environment, then there's not as much of a concern. But the data and the research is actually showing something quite different. This is a graph from a World Wildlife Fund report from a couple of years ago that came up with a global living planet index. And essentially that's an index representing global wildlife populations, that the size of those populations and the health of those populations. And they found that those populations have decreased nearly 70% in the past 50 years. Additionally, there's been studies done by international organizations that have found that close to 1 million species now are at risk of extinction. So clearly there's indications that the wildlife, the animals that depend on nature are also declining and at threat, which is a key signal or a key indicator that these systems that we rely on and dependent on are starting to break down. when we look at the industries with the largest impacts on nature, it's industries like food, beverage, and tobacco, or materials, energy, capital goods. These are the ones that when measured are found to have the highest impacts on nature. And what you'll see is that corresponds also to what we showed earlier, that these are also the industries that are the most dependent on nature. So when you combine, this material dependency with significant impacts and indicators showing that there is a decline in the health of these natural systems, this translates through into risk. And lastly, this is some work that's been done by the Stockholm Resilience Center, which has defined these 9 planetary boundaries. So they're essentially different components of our global ecosystem, which we depend on, but they've also found a way to measure how we're affecting these 9 different boundaries. The green circle in the middle represents what our safe operating space might be. So if we can maintain our activities within that green core, the systems will regenerate and be sustainable. But what they found is that in 6 of these 9 planetary boundaries, we're actually transgressing those safe operating space thresholds, meaning that we're living beyond the means of the ability for the planet to support us. So these are some really strong signals that are starting to create concern amongst the capital markets, essentially. In response to that, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure was developed. Now, this is based largely on the TCFD for climate risk disclosure. And a key principle or design principle of the TNFD was to ensure that there was very close alignment with the TCFD. The TNFD was established, and the task force members represent around 40 individuals from global financial institutions, from corporates, and from professional services. So it's a group that are affected by these natural dependencies and impacts, but also have a keen interest in developing a framework that is practicable, that can be actually applied. And you'll see here, if you're familiar with the TCFD, there's a lot of alignment here, with the exception of 3 additional disclosure areas, one on stakeholder engagement. And this is probably one of the most important differentiators here, is that there's an understanding and a recognition that you have to take into consideration Indigenous people and local communities when you're looking at your dependencies and impacts in nature. There's also a focus on location, so knowing where your business activities are and how you interface with nature. And then really getting into the value chain beyond just your direct operations, looking both upstream and downstream to figure out what your impacts and dependencies are on nature and how those translate through into risks, but also opportunities. And I think this is another key differentiator, is there's a focus on opportunities. And that's because, the saying goes that there's no net zero without nature, and a clear recognition that nature is really going to be part of the solution to addressing climate issues and helping our economy to transition. This is some analysis that came out of the IPCC AR6 report, which looked at the potential contribution of different mitigation options for essentially reducing our global carbon emissions. And the color here shows the price, but the length of the bar here shows the mitigation potential. So in the short term, the mitigation options that make the most sense, renewable energy, wind, solar, as prices come down, those will have an immediate effect. But in the longer term, the bigger opportunities are going to be through agriculture, forestry, and other land use, the so-called AFOLU. And that means increasing carbon sequestration in agriculture, reducing the conversion of forests and other ecosystems, and creating so-called nature-based solutions that can not only mitigate carbon emissions and remove them from the atmosphere, but also improve resiliency to climate change and allow for adaptation. So as an organization, what are some immediate things that you can do right now? Well, there's an expectation that companies will start reporting this. The regulators are starting to look at incorporating nature and creating nature standards. We heard from the ISSB that they'll be focusing on nature in the coming years, and they plan to produce a nature-related standard. Understanding your interface with nature. Where are your business activities located, and how are they impacting nature? Thinking about a nature-positive strategy. How can you turn this from risk into opportunity? And how can you start demonstrating that your business is shifting towards a model that is actually giving back more than it's taking? And then finally, getting ready for the disclosures. It may not just be the regulators in your country, but it might be your customers that are facing regulatory reporting requirements. So I will stop there, and hopefully that's given you all a very sort of quick overview of the topic of nature and why the significance of it is starting to come to the forefront amongst the capital markets and in the business community.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I wanted to ask you one more question, if I may.
Of course.
What is the role, what is the competitive advantage for Latin America in this transition?
It's a great question. And I think for a long time, there's been a perception that a lot of the nature impacts are occurring in areas like Latin America and South America. There's been a lot of press and focus on the Amazon and the significance of the Amazon in terms of its biodiversity, but also the impacts that are occurring there. Water stress in certain regions of South America. But I mean, from my experience working in South America, visiting companies there, I think that there's a lot of progress in terms of sustainable development and sustainable management of natural resources. And I think, as I was saying before, there's a huge opportunity to sort of switch from a risk mindset to an opportunity mindset. So what I would say is that in Latin America, there's a real focus on shifting towards sustainable management of resources and really making that story known through things like disclosures with the TNFD, but also things like certification, et cetera. There's also a recognition that this is becoming a very significant topic in Latin America. And that's exemplified by the fact that the Biodiversity COP, the Conference of Parties, which is the UN conference that happens every 2 years, is actually scheduled to be in Cali, Colombia this year in October. So this is the equivalent of the climate COPs, but for biodiversity. So, a clear signal that in Latin America, this is a topic that is becoming more and more relevant. And I would encourage, everyone on the call to either try to attend or follow the proceedings at that COP conference in Cali.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Vamos a continuar nosotros ahora en idioma español. Estuvo con nosotros Daniel O'Brien, experto de PricewaterhouseCoopers, con perspectivas valiosas del valor de la naturaleza para las empresas en nuestro bloque Capital Natural. Seguimos contigo, Pipo.
Después de una brevísima pausa, seguiremos con un panel para profundizar sobre el tema de capital natural. No se vaya de nexos+1.
El planeta y el mercado exigen la descarbonización de las empresas para construir un futuro sostenible. Para asegurar esta meta, se necesita un camino claro y transversal, para alinear y articular los esfuerzos del negocio y hacerlo parte de su estrategia en todos los niveles y todas las áreas de la empresa. El plan de descarbonización es esa guía que analiza el contexto global, nacional y sectorial para crear una ruta a la medida de cada empresa. Incluye priorizar y monitorear acciones para reducir emisiones, fortalecer capacidades de gestión climática y comunicar efectivamente el progreso hacia las metas climáticas. Y de esta forma aumenta la resiliencia y competitividad ante la creciente demanda de acción climática de los inversores, gobierno, clientes y ciudadanos. Actúa ahora para descarbonizar tu empresa y liderar la transformación hacia una economía sostenible.